Hello?
Belhaven always had this magic about it, a timelessness that felt like it was pulled straight out of a painting. The cobblestone streets, uneven and speckled with moss, wound their way through clusters of cottages painted in soft, muted tones. Every time I walked to the market or strolled by the docks, I could feel the heartbeat of the town, the chatter of shopkeepers, the distant call of seagulls, the crash of waves against the rocky shore. My cottage was perched at the edge of town, close enough to hear the ocean's rhythm day and night. It had been my sanctuary for years, ever since Ethan was a boy. And today, it felt alive in a way it hadn't in a long time, filled with the sense of home and the nervous energy I couldn't quite shake. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the dough-covered counter with my hands resting on my hips. A faint sheen of flour dusted the air, clinging to my deep green cardigan, the one Ethan had given me as a gift years ago, before he'd left for Europe. I'd been meaning to save it for special occasions, and somehow, today felt like the most special of them all. The rosemary roast chicken had been in the oven since mid-afternoon, filling the house with an aroma so rich and inviting it almost felt like a hug. I'd even put a pot of honeyed carrots on the stove, something Ethan always loved as a kid, though I wasn't sure if he still cared for them. I wanted everything to be just right. Every detail mattered. The table had to look warm and inviting but not overly formal. I'd chosen the best linen napkins, the ones I only brought out for holidays, and folded them neatly next to the plates. At the center of the table was a small arrangement of sea glass I'd collected over the years during my walks along the shore. Each piece was smooth and weathered, a perfect reminder of the life we'd shared here in Belhaven before he'd left to chase his dreams. As I finished adjusting the candles on the table, I glanced at the clock. The sun was already beginning its slow descent into the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and violet. He'd be here any moment now. The thought made my chest tighten with equal parts excitement and nerves. It had been so long. Too long. I found myself wondering what Ethan would look like now, how much he might have changed in the years he'd been gone. When he first left for Europe, I'd been so proud of him, proud and terrified honestly. He'd been this ambitious young man with so much drive, determined to carve out a life for himself far from the comfort of home. But in the years since, I'd missed him more than I could put into words. No matter how many calls we had, no matter how many times he sent me pictures of his projects or updates about his life, there was always a gap, a void where his physical presence used to be. I missed the way his laughter filled the room, the way his footsteps echoed in the hall, the way he could make the house feel alive just by being in it. I tugged at my cardigan sleeves nervously, the fabric soft and familiar under my fingertips. It felt like a link to him, a little piece of his love I'd carried with me all these years. Maybe he wouldn't even remember giving it to me, but I hoped seeing it would remind him of home, of me. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I kept pacing between the kitchen and the window, checking the horizon for any sign of his car. Dusk was settling in, and the sky had turned into a masterpiece of gold and lavender, with the ocean reflecting every hue. I found myself staring out at the waves, their steady crash against the shore grounding me in the moment. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure silhouetted against the golden horizon. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen, watching. His tall frame was unmistakable even after all these years. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if that could somehow calm the storm of emotions brewing inside me. He was here. My Ethan was finally home. The sun had dipped lower by the time I saw him, casting a warm golden light over everything. There he was, standing by the gate, his tall frame backlit by the fading glow of the day. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Ethan had always had a way of looking so effortlessly composed, but now he seemed different. Older. Sharper. The boy I'd raised had become a man, and I couldn't quite believe it. "Mom," he called, his voice carrying over the soft murmur of the ocean. I stepped outside, my hands trembling slightly as I smoothed down the front of my cardigan. As soon as I saw his smile, wide, warm, and so unmistakably him, I couldn't hold back any longer. I closed the distance between us, and before I could think twice, I was pulling him into my arms. "Ethan," I breathed, the word catching in my throat. He chuckled, his laugh rich and full as he wrapped his arms around me. "I missed you, Mom," he said, lifting me just slightly off the ground in a gesture so playful and familiar it nearly brought tears to my eyes. When he set me down, he stepped back, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders as he looked at me. His gaze softened, and I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You're wearing it," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. I glanced down at the deep green cardigan, feeling the warmth rise to my cheeks. "Of course I'm wearing it. I couldn't think of a better day to pull it out." He smiled, and for a brief second, he looked exactly like he did when he was younger, when he used to give me those mischievous grins before trying to talk his way out of trouble. But this time, there was something deeper in his expression, something more profound. "I'm glad you kept it," he said. And then, before I could reply, he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that I froze for a moment. His cologne, something woodsy and clean, mingled with the salty ocean breeze, and I felt the familiar sting of tears welling up. "You look beautiful, Mom," he added, his voice low but sincere. I laughed nervously, brushing at my cheek as if that would somehow mask the way my heart was swelling. "Oh, stop. You're just saying that because I'm wearing your gift." "Maybe," he admitted, grinning. "But it's true." The warmth of his kiss lingered as we made our way inside, his hand resting lightly on my back. And for the first time in years, the house felt full again, alive with the kind of love and energy that only Ethan could bring. The dinner table was set perfectly. The candles flickered softly, the centerpiece of sea glass shimmered faintly, and the scent of rosemary roast chicken filled the air. Ethan and I sat across from each other, and I couldn't help but notice how grown-up he looked, his features sharp and confident. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a heaviness that tugged at me. I passed him the basket of warm bread. "Eat up," I said, trying to keep things light. "You're looking a bit too lean for my liking." He chuckled, tearing off a piece of bread. "I've been busy, Mom. And honestly, I've missed your cooking more than I can say." "That's nice to hear," I replied with a smile, but I couldn't ignore the way his laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. I waited for the right moment, watching as he took a bite of chicken and nodded approvingly. "It's delicious as always," he said. "So," I started cautiously, leaning on my elbows, "how's everything else? Life? Outside of work?" He hesitated, his fork pausing midair. The brief flicker of pain across his face didn't escape me. "Well," he began, placing his fork down and lacing his fingers together, "I guess I should tell you, I broke up with Mia." The words hit me like a wave, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Oh, Ethan," I said softly, "I'm sorry." "What happened?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It just wasn't working anymore. We tried, for months. But we were on completely different pages. She wanted something more settled, and I wasn't ready for that. Or maybe I just didn't feel the same way she did." His voice cracked slightly, and I saw him glance away, blinking a little too quickly. My heart ached for him. No matter how old he got, he was still my son, still the boy I wanted to protect from every hurt and heartache. "You don't have to explain," I said gently. "Breakups are hard, no matter the reason." He nodded but didn't look up. "It's just weird, to spend so much time with someone, to think they might be the one, and then realize you're not who they need." There was so much vulnerability in his voice, and it made me want to reach across the table and hold his hand. But I knew Ethan well enough to let him speak at his own pace. "That doesn't make you a bad person," I said softly. "It takes strength to admit when something isn't right, even if it hurts." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, it feels like failure. And now I'm back here alone." "You're not alone," I said firmly, my voice filled with conviction. "You're home, and you've got me." For the first time that evening, his lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." There was a moment of silence between us, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken emotions. I broke it by reaching for his plate, offering more chicken. "And you're staying here as long as you need to," I added. "No arguments. This house is always your home." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a bit. "Thanks," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I'll take you up on that. I think I need some time to figure things out." We finished the meal slowly, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Memories of his childhood, funny stories from when he was little. I could see some of the tension easing from his face, though the sadness lingered just beneath the surface. As we cleared the table together, I found myself watching him closely, noticing the way he moved with a certain quietness, as if he carried an invisible weight. When everything was cleaned up and the kitchen was in order, he turned to me looking a little lost. Without thinking, I stepped closer and cupped his face in my hands. His stubble was rough against my palms, a stark reminder of how much he'd grown. "You're going to be okay," I said softly, looking into his eyes. "You've been through tough times before, and you've always come out stronger. This will be no different." He didn't say anything, just nodded, his lips pressed together as if holding back more than he was ready to share. I leaned in and kissed his cheek gently, lingering for a moment. "I'm here for you always," I whispered. His arms came around me, pulling me into a hug that was tighter than usual. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice thick. "I mean it." As we stood there in the quiet kitchen, the warmth of his embrace and the faint hum of the ocean outside reminded me that sometimes, even as adults, we all need someone to remind us we're not alone. And I was more than happy to be that someone for him. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, waking me earlier than usual. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, filled with the warmth of someone else's presence. Wrapping my robe tightly around me, I padded into the kitchen, fully expecting to start the coffee and prepare breakfast as I always did. But as I turned the corner, I stopped in my tracks. Ethan was already there, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning glow spilling through the window. He wore my apron, one clearly too small for him, and stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes with an air of focused determination. It was such a rare sight that I felt a mix of surprise and amusement, though I couldn't deny the swell of affection rising within me. The faint smell of butter and vanilla hung in the air, blending with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It struck me then just how much thought he had put into this small gesture. Ethan had always been thoughtful, but seeing him like this, comfortable and unguarded in the kitchen, a quiet hum of purpose in his movements, filled me with a sense of pride and tenderness that caught me off guard. On the deck, he had set up a small, charming breakfast nook. A plaid blanket was draped over the table, and a portable heater provided warmth against the January chill. From there, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, its waves rolling rhythmically against the shore, catching the light in a way that made the entire scene shimmer. Ethan carried out a tray laden with pancakes, scrambled eggs, and 2 steaming mugs of coffee, setting everything down with a quiet care that spoke volumes. As I took my seat, the crisp morning air brushed against my face, and for a moment I let myself take it all in. We ate together in the kind of silence that felt like a conversation in itself. There was no need for words as the soft sounds of the ocean filled the space between us. Still, I couldn't help but observe Ethan more closely. His face, once so youthful, now bore the marks of a man who had lived and endured. Yet, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I could see it clearly now. The weight he carried, the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought I wasn't looking. He was trying to hide something, but it was written all over him. As the moments passed, his unease became more apparent. It wasn't just the weariness of someone who had worked too hard or traveled too far. It was deeper, like a wound he hadn't yet figured out how to heal. I knew, without needing to ask, that this was about more than his career or the hectic life he had been leading. Ethan had always been fiercely independent, but the way he held himself now, guarded yet longing for comfort, made me want to reach out and remind him that he didn't have to face it all alone. Finishing the last bite of my pancakes, I placed my fork down and folded my hands in my lap, watching him. There was a moment when his gaze met mine, and in that shared look, I saw the confession he couldn't bring himself to voice. He was hurting, and whatever had happened, it had shaken him. Later, as I cleared the table, I found myself thinking about how much he had changed. There was a quiet strength in him, but also an unmistakable fragility that hadn't been there before. I knew it wasn't my place to push, but I also knew that as his mother, I couldn't ignore what I saw. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the deck as we moved inside. Ethan lingered near the door, his posture more relaxed but his eyes still carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. Without thinking, I walked over to him and pressed a soft kiss to his temple, a gesture meant to console, to reassure him that whatever he was facing, he didn't have to face it alone. His breath caught for a brief moment, and the air between us seemed to shift. I could feel the vulnerability in the touch, the depth of emotion that passed through that simple kiss. And when I pulled back, I met his gaze again, my heart aching for the quiet pain I knew he was holding. In that instant, I could tell that something had changed. The tenderness between us, the closeness we had always shared, felt different now, more fragile, yet stronger. It was a moment of silent understanding, the kind that didn't need words to be meaningful. And I knew, from that simple kiss, that we would figure it out together, whatever it was. The hours slipped by quickly, as they often do when you're lost in the rhythm of the day. I moved around the house, tending to little things, small chores that kept me occupied but also allowed me to think. Ethan spent some time on his phone, catching up on messages, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. Later, we went for a walk along the beach, the cool wind whipping through our hair as the waves crashed against the shore. The ocean always had a way of putting things into perspective, I thought, its vastness reminding me that, no matter what we went through, life would continue to ebb and flow. Ethan walked beside me, a quiet figure at my side, his eyes distant. I wanted to say something, to ask him what was on his mind, but I didn't want to pressure him. He had always been someone who preferred to deal with his feelings privately. And yet, something told me this was different, that he needed to talk, even if he didn't quite know how to start. We stopped at the edge of the water, where the sand felt soft beneath our feet. The sky above us was a pale blue, the sun dipping lower in the horizon, casting everything in golden hues. It was a beautiful sight, but I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, his voice soft and hesitant. He spoke about his recent breakup, his words coming in slow, deliberate phrases as if he were choosing each one carefully. I listened, trying to hold back the urge to interrupt, to offer comfort or advice. But I knew he needed to share it in his own way, without me stepping in and offering solutions. The woman he had been with had been a part of his life for years, and I could see how deeply this loss had affected him. He spoke of the complications, the way things had unraveled between them, how it had started with the best of intentions, but in the end, they had drifted apart. The love he had once felt seemed to have faded, leaving only confusion and regret. I could feel my heart ache for him as he spoke, each word heavy with emotion. As much as he tried to hide it, his sadness was plain to see. I wanted to reach out, to pull him close and make the hurt go away, but I knew the best I could do was to be there, to let him feel safe enough to open up. As he finished speaking, I took a step closer to him, the salty sea air still tugging at my hair. Ethan turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of vulnerability and gratitude. There was a rawness in his expression, the kind you don't often see from someone who has always prided themselves on being strong and self-reliant. I could see the pain in him, how much he was still carrying, how heavy it all felt. I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to remind him that this wasn't the end. Life would go on, and the pain would ease, even if it didn't seem like it now. Without thinking, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him, holding him close. He stood still at first, as if surprised by the gesture, but then I felt his body relax in my arms. He rested his head gently on my shoulder, his breath warm against my skin. It was the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't, tender, protective, and full of love. I stayed there for a moment longer than usual, wishing I could take away the sadness that weighed him down. Finally, when I pulled back slightly, I met his eyes once more. In that moment, I knew he needed more than just comfort. He needed reassurance that, no matter what had happened, he wasn't alone. I pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, lingering there for just a heartbeat longer. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the right one. A kiss that wasn't about romance, but about the bond we shared, a bond that would hold steady no matter how complicated things got. Ethan's eyes softened, and I saw something in them shift, a flicker of warmth of gratitude. It was as if that small kiss had given him a moment of peace, a tiny reprieve from the storm inside him. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile that spoke of deep emotion but didn't quite know how to express it. We stood there for a while longer, watching the waves, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable but comfortable in its own way. It was as though, in that one brief moment, everything had settled. I didn't need to have all the answers, and neither did he. All that mattered was that we had each other. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. It was quiet in the house, the kind of silence that felt comfortable yet heavy with meaning. I moved through the familiar spaces, my mind swirling with the conversation from the night before. There had been something different in the way Ethan had looked at me, in the way he'd spoken. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an intensity there, a depth that felt new, as though something had shifted between us. I set the tea kettle on the stove and watched the steam rise, my thoughts drifting back to his words. He had always been my little boy, the one who needed me, and in many ways he still did. But there was more now. There was a connection, a bond, that went beyond mother and son. It was as though the years apart had forged something unspoken, something stronger, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. I was lost in thought when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his expression soft but unreadable. Ethan's eyes, so like mine in some ways, were now filled with a maturity I hadn't seen before. His features had sharpened in the years he'd been away, and the man who stood before me was no longer the boy who had left this house so long ago. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "I've been thinking. There's something I need to tell you." My heart skipped a beat. I knew this was coming. The moment when the walls we had built around ourselves would come down. I set the kettle aside and turned to face him fully, trying to steady my breathing. My thoughts raced, my pulse quickening. Ethan stepped closer, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. When I left, I didn't really understand everything about myself, about us. I didn't understand how much I needed you, how much you've always been there for me. But now, looking back, it's like I see you differently. His words were soft but full of meaning, and they struck me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I felt the air shift between us, thick with emotion. I wasn't sure what he meant, or where this was going, but I could sense the vulnerability in his voice, the truth of his feelings that he was now willing to share with me. I wanted to speak, to tell him that I understood, that I had always understood, but the words caught in my throat. Ethan's hand reached out, almost hesitantly, and he brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The simple gesture made my heart flutter, a reminder of the closeness we once shared, when he was just a child and I was everything to him. But this was different. This wasn't the same. His touch felt both familiar and unfamiliar, a mix of comfort and something more, a new layer of connection that I hadn't anticipated. I've realized that the way I see you, the way I feel about you, it's more than I thought, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to explain it, Mom, but it's like you're everything to me. You always have been. I couldn't breathe. His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I felt as though the world had paused. There was something raw and vulnerable in the way he spoke to me, something that spoke to the depth of our relationship, but I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if I should pull away, or if I should just listen, just let him say whatever he needed to say. Before I could form a response, Ethan took a step closer, his eyes searching mine with an intensity one hadn't seen before. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at me, a question hanging between us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I need to know that you're still here, that we're still thus, that we can still be close, like we always were." It was then that I realized this wasn't just about him coming home, about the physical distance that had separated us. This was about something deeper. It was about the way our lives had changed, how we had both grown, and how, despite all that, the bond between us remained. I didn't say anything. Instead, I closed the gap between us, my hands trembling as I reached for him. He seemed to understand, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me close. For a long moment, we simply held each other, neither of us saying anything. There was no need for words. The connection between us, the understanding, was enough. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Ethan leaned in. His lips brushed against my forehead first, soft and lingering. And then, without hesitation, his lips met mine, a gentle, tentative kiss. It wasn't forceful or rushed. It was filled with tenderness, With all the years of love and care we had shared, but also with something new, something unspoken. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it felt like a lifetime. When we pulled apart, I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, but also something else, an understanding, a recognition of the bond we had forged. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "but I think I've needed this. I think we've both needed this." I nodded, my heart racing. "We'll figure it out," I whispered back. "We always do."
Bye-bye.